Welcome to our deep dive, listeners. Today we're tackling a fascinating, really complex topic,
Yeah.
the nature of pain and suffering. But through two lenses, we're going to be looking through the lens of Friedrich Nietzsche
Right.
and contrasting his ideas with perspectives from various transhumanist thinkers.
It's a rich area to explore, especially when you consider how Nietzsche's work stands apart from traditional philosophical writing. Thus spoke Zarathustra.
Right.
It's prophetic, it's poetic, using this historical figure of Zarathustra to explore these profound questions about the human condition.
Yeah.
The struggle between good and evil, and what might lie beyond, what Nietzsche called the overhuman.
And this overhuman concept where things get really interesting, especially when we bring transhumanism into the mix,
Absolutely.
because both Nietzsche and transhumanists seem to be pointing towards some sort of evolution or transcendence.
Right.
But the paths they suggest and where they're ultimately headed are pretty different.
Exactly. So to navigate this, complex terrain, we need to understand Nietzsche's core ideas about pain and suffering. What was he pushing back against? How did he come to this radical notion that suffering, that's not something to avoid, but rather something essential for a meaningful life?
So paint a picture for us.
Yeah.
What were the main views on suffering that Nietzsche was challenging?
He identified three dominant perspectives. Each one he systematically dismantled. The first was the Christian view, or more broadly, the monotheistic perspective,
Okay.
which sees earthly existence as, a veil of tears,
Right.
something to endure for the promise of something after an afterlife. So suffering becomes a test of faith,
Yeah.
a trial to overcome for the reward of salvation.
It's got to grin and bear it. The payoff comes later.
Exactly. The second perspective was the pessimistic view,
Right.
deeply influenced by Schopenhauer. Here, suffering is proof of a meaningless existence, dominated by blind, irrational forces. And the logical conclusion, withdrawal, retreat into nothingness, is the only real escape.
Pretty bleak outlook. So what was the third view Nietzsche challenged?
The utilitarian viewpoint. This one aims to minimize suffering, maximize pleasure,
Right.
often framed as, the greatest good for the greatest number. It's more pragmatic, focused on calculated actions to reduce pain, increase happiness.
So we've got three different approaches.
Hmm.
Transcending it through faith,
Right.
escaping it through nihilism, or minimizing it through strategic actions.
Yeah.
And Nietzsche basically said, you're all missing the point.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
He rejected all three because they share a common thread. This urge to negate suffering, to see it as inherently bad, something to eliminate. And here's where his radical departure emerges. He argued suffering is an intrinsic part of being human, interwoven with joy. To deny one is to deny the fullness of life.
That's where amor fati comes into play, right?
Yeah.
This idea of loving one's fate,
Precisely.
embracing everything, including the pain.
Exactly. Amor fati isn't passive resignation, it's an active affirmation. A will to embrace not just the pleasant parts of life, but the challenges, the struggles, the things that test us and force us to grow. And this ties directly to his concept of will to power,
Right.
which often gets misinterpreted as just this brute desire for domination, but it's actually much more nuanced.
So break that down for us. Explain will to power in the context of how Nietzsche viewed suffering. How are they connected?
The will to power is that fundamental driving force in all living things. It's a striving not just for survival, but for growth, expansion, self-overcoming. And suffering, for Nietzsche, isn't an obstacle, but a crucible, a challenge. Forcing it to assert itself, become stronger.
So it's not about seeking out pain,
Right.
but recognizing that suffering's inevitable
Exactly.
in any life, striving for something more.
Yes.
Something beyond comfort and complacency.
Yeah. Exactly. The will to power seeks to overcome limitations, to break free. And that process, well, it inevitably involves confrontation, struggle, and suffering. But it's through this process that we grow, that we reach new heights of strength, creativity, self-realization.
And this is where the tension with transhumanism starts to show, right?
Yes.
Because transhumanists focused on using technology to eliminate suffering seem to be working against this very force Nietzsche saw as essential.
Exactly. And that's what makes this conversation so fascinating.
Right.
We have these seemingly opposing forces, Nietzsche urging us to embrace suffering,
Yeah.
find power within it, and transhumanists striving to eliminate suffering through technology. It's a clash of perspectives that goes to the very heart of what it means to be human and
Wow.
what kind of future we're building.
Before we get into the specifics of how transhumanist thinkers approach suffering, I think we need to touch on another key Nietzschean concept, eternal recurrence.
Ah, yes, eternal recurrence. This is where things get really interesting and potentially a bit unsettling.
So for those who might not be familiar, can you give us a quick rundown of what Nietzsche meant by eternal recurrence?
Imagine living your life with all its joys and sorrows, its triumphs and failures, moments of meaning and utter absurdity. And then imagine living that same life again exactly as it unfolded.
Wow.
Every detail repeated, every sensation re-experienced, and then again and again and again for all eternity. That's the essence of eternal recurrence.
I can feel my brain starting to melt a bit.
It is a dizzying concept.
Yeah. But how does this tie into Nietzsche's view of suffering and the will to power?
Nietzsche presents eternal recurrence as a thought experiment.
Okay.
A way to test your will. He asks, could you face living your life with all its pain an infinite number of times? Could you say yes to it all without reservation, without wanting to change a single thing?
It's a heavy question.
It is.
And I'd imagine for most people, the immediate answer would be no. We'd want to edit out the painful parts, the mistakes, the heartbreaks.
Precisely. And that's Nietzsche's point. He's not saying we should literally believe in eternal recurrence as a cosmological fact.
Okay.
It's a tool for self-evaluation. If the thought of it fills you with dread, with a desire to change your past, it suggests you're not fully embracing life, that you're clinging to a desire for something other than what is.
So being able to say yes to eternal recurrence, to embrace it all, even the painful parts, becomes a measure of the strength of your will to power.
Exactly. And this is where we see a profound connection between amor fati, the will to power, and eternal recurrence.
Okay.
They form a kind of philosophical trinity in his thought, a framework for understanding how to live a truly meaningful life, a life beyond conventional morality, embracing the fullness of human experience.
It's a powerful and definitely challenging perspective. And it sets the stage for exploring how transhumanist thinkers, with their aim of mitigating or even eliminating suffering through technology, might respond to this Nietzschean challenge. Would they see it as a call to embrace life fully, or as an obstacle to overcome in pursuit of a more perfect, less painful future?
That's the question that will guide us as we delve into the arguments and ideas of key figures in the transhumanist movement.
This is going to be quite a deep dive.
It is.
But before we journey there, I think we need to look closer at the key areas where transhumanists are actively trying to mitigate suffering using technology.
Let's explore the interventions they propose and the underlying assumptions about suffering that drive them. We've laid the groundwork with Nietzsche's perspective, his radical embracing of suffering as like a catalyst for growth and realizing that will to power, all tied up with amor fati and eternal recurrence. Now, where do transhumanists fit in? Do they see eye to eye with this at all, or are their goals totally different?
That's the key question, especially as we start to look at how transhumanists actually plan to reduce suffering through technology. The specifics.
One area where this tension is immediately apparent is the transhumanist focus on aging and longevity. Thinkers like Aubrey de Grey, a leading figure in biogerontology, they see aging as a disease, a process of accumulating damage that leads to decline and eventually death. And they believe this process, with all its physical and mental suffering, can be stopped, and maybe even reversed, through tech interventions.
So extending lifespan. Pushing back the boundaries of what we consider a natural lifespan.
Precisely. And some transhumanists, they go even further, aiming for radical life extension, maybe even immortality. They see death itself as the ultimate suffering, something to be conquered and transcended.
That's a stark contrast to Nietzsche's view.
He
saw that yearning for an afterlife and escape from death as a sign of weakness. A denial of the power and potential of this life.
Yes, and the transhumanist pursuit of immortality is directly challenging that view. For them, death isn't an integral part of life, but an obstacle to overcome, a problem to solve with technology.
Now let's shift gears to another area transhumanists are interested in, enhancement technologies. These aim to improve our capabilities and address suffering through various interventions, from genetic modifications to neurochemical interventions.
Yeah, the idea is to use technology to directly target and alleviate suffering, like at its source,
Right.
whether it's a genetic predisposition to a disease or a mental condition causing distress.
We see figures like Nick Bostrom, a leading philosopher and transhumanist, advocating for the development of technologies that could eliminate suffering on a biological level. He imagines a future where we might use genetic engineering to eliminate predispositions to certain diseases or mental conditions that cause suffering.
Bostrom even argues that technology can help us create a more just and equitable society, which in turn would reduce suffering on a larger scale. He sees potential in automation and AI to create a world of abundance where everyone's needs are met and poverty and scarcity are gone.
There's a definite echo of utilitarianism in that. This focus on maximizing well-being and minimizing suffering for the most people.
Exactly. And here's where the potential clash with Nietzsche really comes out. If suffering is essential for growth and the development of that will to power, as Nietzsche argued, wouldn't a world without suffering, a world of ease and comfort, ultimately lead to stagnation, a weakening of the human spirit?
It raises a question about the very nature of suffering. If we engineer it out, do we lose something fundamental about being human?
That's a question transhumanists grapple with themselves.
Yeah.
They acknowledge there are potential downsides to completely eliminating suffering, like losing virtues or character traits that come from facing adversity.
Bostrom, for instance, proposes creating virtual environments where people could safely experience challenges without real-world harm.
It's an attempt to balance that desire for well-being with the recognition that suffering shapes us.
It almost feels like a concession, recognizing that the world without suffering might create this existential void. But the solution, simulated suffering, it feels kind of artificial, a pale imitation of the real thing. Another transhumanist thinker with an interesting take on this relationship is Max Moore, known for his concept of extropy.
Extropy, emphasizing constant progress, improvement, both individually and as a species. And for Moore, technology is the key driver.
Moore's view is fascinating because he seems to get that suffering plays a role in driving progress, pushing us to find solutions, overcome challenges.
He argues that a lot of human ingenuity comes from this desire to alleviate suffering, to make life easier, more comfortable.
That's where he and Nietzsche might actually agree.
Yes.
But Moore also argues we're reaching a point where technology lets us go beyond the need for suffering entirely. He envisions a future of dynamic optimism, where we're constantly improving and expanding without needing struggle or adversity.
Moore's vision of dynamic optimism seems to imply suffering's just a temporary hurdle, a problem to be solved, not an intrinsic part of being human.
Which puts him directly at odds with Nietzsche, who saw suffering as this eternal recurrence, a fundamental aspect of existence we have to confront, not escape.
Moore might counter that the nature of suffering itself will change as technology advances. We might face new challenges that we can't even imagine now, even as we eliminate the traditional forms of suffering.
So like a transcendence of suffering, but not necessarily elimination. But would this new technologically driven suffering even be recognizable, would have the same weight as the suffering Nietzsche talked about?
That's where things get really interesting. We have to ask, what's the essence of suffering? Is it just pain and adversity or something deeper, something tied to our very being?
We've been through Nietzsche's perspective on suffering, his embrace of it as crucial for growth and that will to power. And we've explored the many different views within transhumanism, from those wanting to reduce suffering with technology to those who imagine a future where suffering is basically gone. This brings us to a big question. One that sits right at the intersection of Nietzsche and transhumanism. What would Nietzsche have thought of transhumanism? Would he have seen it as a continuation of his ideas about self-overcoming? Or as a dangerous departure from real human flourishing?
It's impossible to say for sure, of course. But we can do a thought experiment, a kind of philosophical what if, based on what we know about his core ideas and his critiques of the philosophical and cultural trends of his time.
Okay, so let's play that out. It's probably safe to say Nietzsche wouldn't have been a fan of trying to create a world with zero suffering.
Right.
A world of pure bliss achieved through technology.
Yeah. He saw suffering as so connected to growth, to the process of becoming a world without it, a world of just comfort and complacency, would probably seem like a dead end to him, denying the very things that make us strive, overcome, create.
He'd probably see that kind of world as a breeding ground for what he called the last man.
Yes, the last man.
Passive content, no ambition, no creativity, no will to power.
Yeah.
For Nietzsche, that was the ultimate decline of humanity, a descent into mediocrity, meaninglessness.
So no virtual reality suffering simulators or engineered bliss for Nietzsche.
He'd probably see those attempts to artificially create or simulate suffering as missing the point.
Exactly.
For him, suffering isn't just a feeling to avoid or manipulate, but an existential confrontation that shapes who we are, reveals our potential.
And what about the transhumanist pursuit of radical life extension, maybe even immortality? Would Nietzsche have been on board with trying to conquer death through technology?
It's hard to imagine him embracing immortality.
Yeah.
He saw death as a part of life,
a
necessary balance to our limited existence, reminding us that each moment matters. To try to live forever, to escape death, that would probably seem like weakness to him. A failure to accept the basic conditions of being human.
He might even argue that wanting immortality comes from fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of facing the void. And for Nietzsche, fear paralyzes you. It blocks the will to power.
Exactly. He believed we should aim to live in a way where we'd be willing to repeat our lives with all the good and bad an infinite number of times.
That eternal recurrence.
Yes. Not meant to be taken literally, but as a way to assess how authentic and affirming our lives are.
If the thought of it makes you afraid, if you'd want to change things, it shows you're not really embracing your existence.
You're still wanting something other than what is.
So wanting to live forever probably comes from that same place, not being able to fully accept the present moment.
Wanting to escape our limits, our finite existence.
It's a form of clinging, refusing to let go and accept the flow of becoming.
So far, it doesn't sound like Nietzsche would be a big fan of transhumanism. But are there any parts you might actually like? Any common ground?
There are. Remember, Nietzsche was a radical thinker. He disrupted norms and values. He criticized the complacency and herd mentality of his time. He called for a reevaluation of everything, a questioning of the foundations of morality and culture.
In that sense, he might have liked the boldness of transhumanism. This willingness to challenge limits and push boundaries.
Exactly. That drive to use technology to transcend our biology, to reshape what it means to be human, that might have resonated with his idea of self-overcoming.
And there's another aspect that might have aligned with his thinking. Many transhumanists stress self-transformation. Using technology to boost our cognitive abilities, our creativity, our well-being. That focus on self-enhancement could be seen as a modern version of Nietzsche's emphasis on self-cultivation.
Developing your full potential.
Nietzsche focused on self-cultivation through education, self-reflection, pursuing art and intellect. But he might have seen how technology could play a role. He might have seen it as a tool to amplify our abilities, expand our horizons, reach new heights of creativity and self-mastery.
But of course, he was wary of using technology uncritically, of that mindless pursuit of comfort and ease, which could weaken the will. He'd probably warn against using tech as a crutch, a way to dodge the challenges that we need for growth.
So maybe he wouldn't have dismissed all forms of enhancement. He might have seen how technology, used the right way, could actually strengthen the will, push us towards greater self-realization.
The key for Nietzsche would be the intention behind using the technology. Are we using it to run from suffering, to create a world of just comfort? Or are we using it to empower people, to face their limits, strive for more, embrace their existence fully with all the ups and downs?
That question goes to the core of transhumanism.
It does.
And makes us think about the ethics of our choices. Are we using technology to create a world that truly affirms life? A world where the human spirit can flourish?
A good question.
Or are we engineering a world that's safe, comfortable, and ultimately empty, missing the very things that give our lives meaning?
Those are the questions we have to face as we move into this uncharted territory of technological advancement.
Yeah.
And we may never know for sure what Nietzsche would have said,
Right.
but his work gives us a powerful way to look at our own assumptions and motivations as we shape the future.
On that note, dear listener, we leave you to consider these potential meeting points and conflicts between Nietzsche's vision and the transhumanist quest. May your own exploration of these ideas be full of intellectual rigor, critical self-reflection, and a deep appreciation for the complexities of being human.
And remember, as you explore these challenging ideas, keep the spirit of eternal recurrence in mind.
Yeah.
Ask yourself, would I live this life again with all its joys and sorrows? The answer might just reveal how committed you are to living a life truly worth affirming.
Until next time, keep diving deep. And may your explorations lead you to a deeper understanding of yourselves, the world, and what's possible at the intersection of technology, suffering, and the human spirit.